Welcome to another episode of B2B Startup Growth. I'm Shoa Mankhaus, and in this podcast, I aim to share with you wisdom from some of the smartest B2B startup leaders and professionals that I know. We talk about all aspects of marketing, sales, growth hacking, life hacking, and everything in between. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Shoa.
So glad that we can do an episode together.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I love talking about this, so I'm happy for the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, great. So why don't you introduce yourself for the people who don't know you yet?
Sure, happy to. My name is Rob Cohen. I'm a marketer and a storyteller, and I've been doing that for about 25 years now. It's hard for me to say that, but it is 25 years. I've been fortunate enough to work with both large multinationals and also some small, cool, innovative startups. I've also been lucky enough to work in 3 countries on 3 different continents, working in both consumer verticals and also B2B verticals. So about 10 years ago, a friend of mine asked me if I can help him build a website. And I said, of course, absolutely. I'd never built a website in my life, but I did it for him. And I need to thank him again and again and again, because it was he who helped me find my calling. Going through the project, I realized just how much I love storytelling, communication, visual communication. And so for the last 10 years, I've been working with companies, helping them tell their stories. And that's what I do with Penguin and other clients.
That's wonderful. And in the last 3 years that I've been working with you here in Penguin, I really learned to recognize the very unique insights that you bring, which I'd like to discuss with you today, that the insights that are particularly related to how startups should do branding. And I believe you bring a very unique kind of wisdom, and I'd love to share this with our audience. So why don't you, everybody knows what branding, everybody thinks they know what branding is, but I think that most people hold one of many variations of the definition. And let's say, I want to ask you, Rob, from your perspective, in the context of startups, what is branding? What would you put under branding?
Well, let me talk actually about brand as opposed to branding, and then we'll move into the process of branding.
Go ahead.
So often people say, what is a brand? And the way I like to think about it is that your brand is your everything. And I know that's a big statement, but it really is. It says everything about who you are and about what you want to be and about how you portray yourself or your company to the outside world. And I think just as importantly, it's your brand that portrays what your employees feel and say about your company. And it also portrays what your customers feel and say about your company. It's just to follow on from that, it's really interesting. I always say that if you spend enough money, you can fool your customers for a certain period of time, but eventually they're going to work out who you are. Incidentally, you can't do that with your employees. You can't fool them. They'll know who you are, and that's how they'll portray their image of the brand. Mm-hmm. But it's so important to get those two aligned, both your customers and your employees aligned as to who you are, because that's how the world is really going to see you, and make sure that that's aligned with what it is that you see yourself in yourself, and that's your brand.
I love what you're saying. Also, I would even add to that I find a lot of times working with startups, people believe that whatever they decide their company's positioning to be, they think that is their brand. Now, I like to clarify to them, I often use this example to clarify to them what is the difference between their positioning and what is their brand, by saying to them, okay, you go to a meeting with a client, you tell them your pitch, you give them your pitch. 5 days later or so, the person who heard you talks to their colleague and tells them something about you, like just a couple sentences of who you are. And what And that is what's stuck with him in his mind about you. And that is your brand. So it's what people remember about you and what they feel about you after when you're not in the room.
That's so true. And it's what somebody feels or remembers about you is about so much more than just your logo or how pretty your presentation is, or even how cleverly the message is, how cleverly it's written in your presentation. It's about every single touch point that that person has had with you and with your brand. So certainly they'll see your website, they'll see your social posts. If you have a product, they'll look at the product itself, the packaging, maybe the product interface if it's a software product. They might see a billboard. And I think every single time a customer interfaces with your brand, they're going to learn something positive or negative about who you are. Sometimes we forget. I mean, there are companies that have call centers, and we tend to think about branding as something visual. But the way somebody answers, a call center representative answers the phone, is just as much going to influence what somebody feels about your brand as the way the logo looks. You know, I'll give you an example. I shop at a supermarket in our neighborhood. And even before I've entered the store, I drove up last night. The parking lot is filthy. It's filled with litter. I had to fight my way through weeds to get into the store. Now, sure, they've got a beautiful logo above the entrance to the store. But even before I've walked into the store, there's a negative bias. I have a negative bias about the supermarket. Now, at some point when their competitor moves into my neighborhood or online shopping becomes a little bit more friendly in the grocery industry, they're going to lose my business because there's some dissonance, there's some negative bias I have about what the company is selling me and the feeling I have related to that.
So we often refer to that as the sentiment towards the brand, right? And sentiment is something that is in your subconscious, and it influences the way you think about the brand. And so I have a question to you. I find that often, because I work mostly with B2B brands, a lot of CMOs tend to think that the sentiment towards a B2B brand is very, very heavily, if not solely, reliant on their product proposition. Do you feel that that is true?
I feel that product proposition can influence sentiment, but it's not the only thing. And you're right that consumer brands have been at the forefront of leading sentiment type marketing efforts or campaigns. But if you noticed over the last few years, some of the leading technology companies have realized that creating a positive bias amongst their customers that's really related to shared values can help them in the sales and marketing process. So I'll give you a couple of examples. IBM is a great example. For years, IBM have had a program that supports women in technology. It's really about trying to encourage young women who are finishing high school, they're about to make a career choice, and IBM is telling them computer science is something that you should be looking at. This isn't just a male-dominated industry. And they have a particular campaign that's called Coders, which talks about young women and how they feel so empowered by the fact that they found their calling in life via coding. In fact, in the transcript for this podcast, maybe we can put a link to that YouTube video, because in a word, it's just inspiring. And that's IBM, the most B2B conservative gray organization that you can think of, who are trying to influence customer sentiment by a very touchy-feely type campaign. And it's great to see. And there are other examples.
Right.
Salesforce is a good example.
You know what? I'd like to add here that one of my favorite books in the world is Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And he goes on in the book to explain something that most of us actually intuitively know. And that is that most decisions, business decisions even, are made, especially by professionals that are highly educated and experienced in their field. They are made, the decisions are actually made instantaneously, the business decisions, by some kind of intuition and gut feeling. And then afterwards, because you're a professional and you have the obligation to run through a very deep analytics mechanism and a process, you do all that. You run through a mechanism of decision making. You involve all the buying unit, and we'll, in other episodes, we'll be discussing all the buying unit and the funnel and everything. But when you do it, you have already the bias of your initial intuitive preference.
Absolutely.
And the bias is very important.
No doubt.
And your branding is supposed that the purpose of doing good branding is to create that bias in your favor.
That's so true. Another great example is SAP, right? They were founded, I guess, 60, 70 years ago with the purpose of helping the world to run better and changing people's lives. And they've run a couple of campaigns recently which are really about how their customers are using their product to change huge issues that we all face, climate change, and big economic challenges, societal issues, where customers are using SAP to make things run better. And that creates a very positive emotional bias. And as you mentioned, the buyers, their potential customers, are people who are influenced by emotional bias. Right. And these shared values that they now start to see between themselves and SAP will only give SAP an advantage when the time comes for them to start justifying why they chose SAP, even without having known that they've chosen them.
So you know what? I'm sure that our listeners, a lot of them are startup members and founders and CMOs, and they're thinking, okay, when I'll have the budgets of SAP to do marketing, I'll also do all kinds of campaigns, cause-based, and I'll contribute to the society in many ways, and I'll have the budget to allocate for that, and then I'll have the budget to make really beautiful movies about it and everything. But right now I'm in a startup, and my budget is very limited, and I actually have to build a brand ground up. And what are the first things you do? And could you tell us what do you recommend the first things to do or to look at when you plan what to do in branding when you're a startup?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question, and it is the starting point for so much of what we do with our clients on a day-to-day basis. And I think the first step is to really define, or in some cases to redefine, what are the values of your company? What does your company stand for? What are the principles that form the basis for how you do business? It's kind of like a compass that you can turn to, that every time you have a decision to make, you can start to work out whether that fits into your company's values or not. And I know that sounds a little bit soft, but it's so crucial because, as we spoke about earlier, what both your employees and your customers feel about you are related to the values within your brand. If you don't have the ability to define those, it's very hard to portray those to the outside world. So I would start with brand values, and there are exercises and workshops, etc., that we can run to help define those. And I think the second thing that needs to be defined is your brand promise. What is the actual value that you're bringing to your clients? And so often when we meet with particularly startups who are often founded by technologists, by engineers, they mention product features and why their product works a little bit faster, or it's not necessarily the value that their clients see. And I think if in order to really build a brand, you need to define very clearly what's the value, what's your brand promise that you're bringing. Before we start a process with any of our customers, I absolutely insist on running a very simple exercise. And I won't go forward unless we run this exercise. And it's called the who, what, why, how exercise, where we are who, what, why, and how.
And how. Okay. Explain each.
Right. So we ask our clients to try and define who they are in one sentence, maybe two. What do they do? Most importantly, why are they different? And how does it even matter to their customers? And it's really the last two that help to define that value or brand promise that we spoke about. So why are you different, and why does that matter to your customers? Now, it's so interesting how so often when we ask our clients to do this, if we give it to 3 or 4 senior people in the organization, we get such a wide range of answers back that you can see that even within an organization, there's disagreement or dissonance.
Right. First of all, I want to comment that when we hooked up together 3 years ago, you told me that that's your practice, and I took that with me to multiple occasions with clients. And first of all, I want to thank you because I love it, because it works really good. And another thing that's really interesting from my experience is that when I give this exercise to startups, they say, sure, okay, we'll answer it. Yeah. And first of all, they give you really long answers, right? About who you are or why should anybody care. Yeah. They give really long answers. And if we insist for them to give a very, very short answer, then it becomes super difficult.
Oh, you're so right. And look, the bottom line is it's much, much harder to write a short answer than a long answer. But I insist on it. It can't be more than 1 or 2 sentences. And I insist on the thought process. Mm-hmm. What tends to happen, you get answers back like, we're breakthrough, mm-hmm. or we're groundbreaking, or we're innovative. And the two that I love the most, we're game changers, right? Or we're next generation. Yes. Right? And that's when we know we've got our work cut out for us.
By the way, all the words that you just mentioned, I will put it in the notes of this episode of the words to exclude from the who we are and why we exist. Absolutely. But it's a really great exercise. It doesn't take too long. Normally there's 2 or 3 rounds of ping pong between us and the client. And we eventually get to this blueprint. And that acts as the basis for everything. And what it helps us do is to really crystallize your positioning, the company's positioning relative to the market, relative to the industry, relative to your competitors. And from that point of view, you can start to do a little bit of research as to, what's your positioning relative to all of these? What are you bringing to the market? What are you doing that's a little bit different? And from there, you start to talk about how do you portray that? What's your tone? So we spoke about IBM, which is, gray suit guys selling to a gray suit industry, super conservative, and there's a place for that. Versus maybe a young, hippie, cool startup app that's selling to millennials or Generation X. That all of that influences not only the visual identity that we're about to develop, but also the tone of voice, the type of messaging, the wording that you use. It's all of these pieces of the puzzle that we start to fit together to get them going through the branding process. Okay, so let's say we work with a client, we give them these 5 answers, we run a process to get these answered concisely. Yes. Okay, what then?
So the start of the process is that short, who you are, what you do, mm-hmm. etc. But it then becomes a much deeper process, which can go any one of 2 ways, and we'll talk about those 2 ways in a sec. But just to take one step backward, often clients come to us and they deliberate with us or amongst themselves as to when is the right time to run a branding or a rebranding project. Right. Is it the right time?
Right.
In most cases, if they're asking that question, the answer is now. Because there's something that's telling them in their business intuition that the timing is right. Normally, we can help sift through whether that's truly the case or not. And there are cases where we've said to companies, hang on, what you've got is perfectly fine for now. Mm-hmm. Let's just keep on iterating as opposed to rebranding. Mm-hmm. But in most cases, when a client comes to us and says, is it the right time to rebrand or brand? The answer is yes. Now,
So tell me, what in your mind is the difference between just investing more in building your brand versus rebranding in the context of a startup? What's the difference?
So I think it kind of, maybe I'll try and build an analogy around that. It depends on the maturity of your business. And if I liken that to the maturity of a family, some startups are like a young, maybe a single person, man or woman, who's renting or maybe even living in a caravan. Right? And they need to have a good, solid home to live in. It needs to be comfortable and practical. Mm-hmm. But it's not the same as a family that's ready to build a house. Because when you build a house, you've got to make sure that your foundations are really, really solid. So if you're a company that's either already has a house and wants to move to a bigger house, mm-hmm. or you're ready to build your first house, you've purchased the land, you've made the commitment, you know what type of house you want, then that will lead you down a certain branding path. If you're, on the other hand, the startup that's living in a rented apartment or a caravan, again, you need to have a solid place to live, but it's a slightly different path to make sure that where you come home to every night is suitable to you and what you're trying to achieve.
I like that very much. I want to suggest another thought about when I call it rebranding versus when I call it let's make an investment in building your brand. Which, every startup starts out with something, some kind of positioning and some kind of statement, and then gradually, as they start building out their means of communication and means of engagement with the world, their brand starts building out. But often, when do I suggest to them that they need a rebrand? It's when there's something about them that something people know about them that needs to be changed. Then I would call that a rebrand, because we need to get people to think something different about you. Until today, they thought you were a security company, and now they're actually understanding that you're also an infrastructure supplier, not just security company. Okay, so you need to rebrand yourself as an infrastructure provider. Or until now, they thought of you as consultants of IT, and now they need to perceive that you are a product company, actually, and you need to rebrand yourself because they don't perceive you that way. Yep. That's definitely calls for a rebrand, right?
Absolutely agree. I think there are also other instances that might call for a rebrand. Okay. Sometimes a change in management. The management's going to give a different spin to how they tell the story. Right. And there might also have been a negative bias towards the previous product offering, previous brand, and an upgrade needs to be given. But I also think that as branding experts, we're able to look at any brand and in most cases give good feedback to the client as to whether the brand has the right foundations or has legs to carry them through the next period of time. Now, if you a young startup, the next period of time might be 2 to 3 years. And it's okay if a startup rebrands after 2 or 3 years. It's perfectly okay. But if you're a larger corporate or a larger enterprise, the next period might be 5 to 10 years or more. And I think each case needs to be evaluated to see what's the type of tweak or iteration that needs to be done to your brand. And we can help with that process.
So tell me, let's take an example of a company, a startup. Let's say they are past the phase of, they have met product market fit. They know what their product is. They've made a few deals. They've sold it a few times. Now they're at the stage where they need to scale up their customer acquisition process. And they understand that now part of that is also establishing a brand. So what would be the next step in implementing this after they figured out who they're selling to, what they're there for, and why should anybody care about that? Let's say they crystallize all that. Yep. What are the practical steps and the things that they need to really invest in to build out this brand?
So if we have the brand values in place and we have the brand mission in place, or the brand promise, if all of that's pretty clearly laid out, I think we can start to look at the tone of voice of who the way that they want to get the message across. And largely that's determined by who they're selling to and their positioning vis-a-vis their competitors, relative to their competitors. And once we have that, that's a pretty good starting point for the designers to start putting a visual identity together. And now this is also an iterative process. And while it can be, on the one hand, challenging and stressful, it's a fun process because clients get back from the designers a mirror image of what they've portrayed to them. And so it's a kind of like a way for them to introspectively look at, do they really have their message down pat? Is it right? Is this how people truly see me? And in some cases, there's a good alignment between those. And in some cases, we need to change course in terms of the first concepts of visual identity that we've presented in order to make sure that we're on track. But it's a fun process. But it takes time.
Right. So I have a question I think that's going to be, your answer is going to be very useful for a lot of my audience. Okay. So let's say that I'm a CMO of a startup like that, or head of marketing, and my designers or my agency or whoever's doing my visual identity comes up with a few variations and they bring it up to me, or my internal team created something and they bring it up to me. What are the criteria that I should use to judge which of them is best? And I'm asking this because one of the biggest challenges around this issue is that people have different tastes.
Yes.
And often a lot of people prefer one design over the other, and it's not always for the right reasons. So can you please give us like directions? How should we judge these different designs? What are the criteria of good and bad?
So I'm not sure if you're working with a good agency, and there are many of them. In most cases, you're going to get a range of good to excellent. If you got bad, you're working with the wrong agency. But let's assume you're working with a good group of people. You're going to get somewhere between good and very good, or good and excellent. Now, my gut feeling says that the right answer to that question is you'll know it when you see it. But that's not always the case, because in many cases, it's the founder himself.
Wait, let me dwell on that first answer. You actually, when you say you'll know it when you'll see it, what you're actually strengthening is the point in the Blink book, right? That you have a person who's looking at it actually has vast experience in life.
Yes.
And in marketing. And when they see something that's good, their intuitive wisdom is going to tell them this is good. Right. And it's going to be based on lots of criteria actually that run in their back mind. Correct. But it's actually going to be also intuitive. Now, I think that is totally true for those with a lot of experience. So now, with the rest of your answer, try to help also those who are not as experienced. What are the criteria that are more rational that you can judge by?
Okay, so I'm a believer that you don't see good design. You can't see good design, you feel it. And it goes slightly back to you'll know it when you see it. You could change that to you'll know it when you feel it. Now, my advice to both experienced and lesser experienced marketing executives or marketing professionals is trust your intuition, but also listen to trusted advisors, which is super important. Now, in many cases with visual identity, there's no right or wrong. And you might get two good examples or even two excellent examples. But I would go back to the original criteria. Keep going back to the original criteria of not only your brand values, but your brand promise. And does the visual identity that's been presented to you align with your brand promise? And that needs to be viewed in a context of who are you selling to? So if the designers who've presented this to you have not done so, I think you should ask them to show you how the design would look in a wide range of different mock-ups or applications. Mm-hmm. What would a potential homepage look like? What my social identity might look like, social media identity. What would it look like on a billboard, even if I'm never going to take out a billboard, or I'm not going to do that in the next few years? What might I look like at a trade show, etc.? And that, again, all needs to be looked at in context of what would I look like relative to the industry, right, relative to my competitors.
Yes. Am I going to stand out?
Am I going to stand out? We've seen industries. We recently ran a rebranding project for a client where the client gave us their 4 or 5 top competitors, and all of them, they had a visual identity that was blue.
Right.
So it was pretty simple for us to say, if you want to stand out,
don't be blue.
Don't be blue. They went for red, incidentally. Okay. So,
what field they were in?
Data analytics in loyalty marketing.
Okay.
So data mining application.
Right.
So just to go back to the point of how do you evaluate good design, trust your intuition, listen to trusted advisors. There's one potential trap in this process, though. And we see it all the time, particularly with startups or sometimes even more mature companies, where the founder, who is often also the CEO and often also the person leading the project, originally designed the logo.
Yes.
Or his nephew
Right.
or sister-in-law designed the logo.
Yes.
And then they
get very emotionally attached to it.
Very, which on the one hand is good because it shows you how you do get emotionally attached to a logo,
Right.
and it's not just a logical process. On the other hand, you need to convince them to just let go.
Right. By the way, they get very emotionally attached to it, even if it's not their nephew.
That's true.
They just get logos is something that founders get very attached to. So let's dwell on this a little bit more, because logo is often a point where I meet a lot of companies at the verge of them needing to make a bigger investment now in their brand. Yes. And there's always this question of, should we change our logo? Right. Or should we keep the existing one because we want to, for continuity? So what would be the criteria that calls for a change?
Well, one would need to try and identify not only the amount of equity in the current logo, in other words, how much do people really know it and recognize it, but also the value of that equity. So what do people associate? Let's assume people know it widely, but what do they associate? What do they think of when they see that logo? And when the answer is that they have both wide exposure and good positive connotations with a sentiment with the logo, then perhaps they don't need a complete rebrand. Sometimes they just need a small tweak. Google are a great example. They've tweaked their logo so subtly in the last few years, once or twice, where everyday people like you and me who use Google all the time may not have even noticed the changes, but we feel them. So on the one hand, you'll have clients who will just need a slight tweak. On the other hand, we're certainly going to see that either there's not enough exposure or knowledge of the current logo, or alternatively, there's a negative sentiment towards the logo. In cases like that, we normally look for going down a different direction. And again, it's a fun process because the logo is the basis for the visual identity. It's the basis for the language that you're going to use, but it's only a relatively small part of the basis. From that, we build out an entire visual identity because the logo seldom gets seen in isolation. It's always within context of a website or a social post or a PowerPoint presentation. And that's why the entire visual identity is so important to the process. I want to go back to one point that we missed though. So you asked me about judging, what's the right direction, which is better, which is right. What we've often seen with startups, when they're raising money, they'll go to the best financial advisor, they'll use the best lawyers, they'll pay top dollar for great tax accountants. But when it comes to logo design, they think they can do it themselves. And they can't.
Right.
Or I've never seen one who can. So there are things that are worth spending money on. And there are things that are worth spending time on. We often see customers fall into the trap of, they'll come to us and say, well, my friend got a logo designed on Fiverr and cost him $49. And I guess you could probably also go to a tax accountant that you paid $49. But, is that the right way to build your business? So if you're going to use trusted advisors in other fields, I think that you should consider using a trusted advisor in the field of visual identity.
Right.
And choose them carefully, but place your trust in them. They normally are professionals. They know what they're doing. And if you work closely with them, you'll get a good result. Just to emphasize that point, if you work closely with them, you'll get a good result. This isn't a question of, here's the brief, please design a logo. It's a process.
Right. So let me talk to you about the process a little, because I find another angle of this challenge that face a lot is that companies come to us, and very often it's at the time where all of a sudden they realize that, oh no, there's this really big important event within 3 months from today. Maybe in the worst scenario, it's in 1 month, okay? and they all of a sudden realize, we need a new website for that because ours looks horrible. Right. Please, can you do it for us? And so we say to them, okay, it's not a problem to program a website in a month. That's not a problem, or even in a day. Yep. The problem is you need, in order to do something, a new website, for example, needs to reflect your new vision or your new positioning or your branding. And in order to do it properly, you need to invest properly. And so, I guess every professional likes to be given a task to do, if it's a branding for a company, to do it properly, okay, from the ground up, follow the right process, as you mentioned, through all the steps, iterations in every step, get feedback from, intuitive feedback, and then consultants' feedback, expert feedback, and then iterate and so on. Yes. Often we face the challenge, and especially with startups, that this moving very quickly is on the top of their priority. Yep. And so they say, okay, we would love to do a proper in-depth process with you, but we don't have the privilege. We got to run. We got to run. We have a show in 2 months that we need to be ready for. And you got to do whatever. And we have to do whatever it takes to just be ready for the show. We don't have time to do all these proper workshops and persona analysis and values analysis and select the company culture and values. And then afterwards do a brand book accordingly and blah, blah, blah. They don't have time. So what do you think is the right way for a startup to go about dealing with the fact that they need to move really fast and produce things, online assets immediately, versus the fact that you need to do things properly in depth, build foundations properly? How should they deal with that?
So, this is something we deal with every day. We walk a fine line between your desired state and reality. And what you just described with startups is that the reality is such where often we don't have the luxury of the desired state. We don't have a 6-month window to run the in-depth research and run the process the way that it should be done. And we're completely cognizant of that. And that's the reality that we also face. So and we spoke about 2 different paths that companies can take depending on their maturity. So if a mature company is going through a rebranding, they should look at a horizon of 4 to 6 months. If you really want to do it properly. But if you're a startup and you have an event in...
What do you mean look at a horizon of 6 months? It should take you 6 months, the whole process?
The process should take somewhere between 4 and 6 months, which, is a fairly lengthy period of time. Mm-hmm. There are obviously financial implications of that. And most importantly, there are implications related to management time. Okay. Right? Management's got to be on board. Let's assume we're now looking at a more prevalent reality, which are startups who don't have either the management attention or the 6 months or the budget for that process. We would take them through a faster, accelerated program. I would say it's 60 days. To do it within 60 days is challenging, but we've done it in 60 days. We all end up after the 60 days, both the client and the team. We need a holiday after it, right? Yeah. But it's doable. Mm-hmm. I think that in cases like that, the brand needs to be cognizant of the fact that this isn't likely to be something that will carry them through for the next 20 years. It's an interim phase that will carry them through the next 2 to 3 years in a good outcome, but it's very doable. And we are experienced enough to be able to, on the one hand, get from them the information that we need, and on the other hand, when we can't get it from them, use our own intuition and our own experience based on our, what we know of them and the industry and the process to come up with a good solution for them. So it's doable.
Right. I find actually that it's very useful to look at the branding process as an ongoing thing that takes a year for a startup. Because I find that, again, it all depends on what stage I meet this the startup. But because startups in their earlier stages, they pivot a lot in their positioning. Even if their product, of course, if you're still in product discovery stages, that's for sure. That's not the phase that I'm at all talking about right now. But I'm talking about companies who are already past the phase of product discovery. They know what they're selling. Now they're developing it and they are trying to build their customer acquisition. And they have some notion of what is their competitive differentiation. And typically, this is really the situation. 2 months later, or 3 months later, they have a slightly different view of what is their competitive positioning.
Right.
And then 2 months after that, they might have a different view of what's their most important persona, because they've just realized that in this buying process, instead of the CISO being the one making the decision on this product, for example, it's actually the head of IT who makes the decision on this kind of product. Or they actually realize that now most important is to sell into the users of their system rather than the executives, because the users are the ones that are most influential in selecting a system or whatever. So my experience is that over the course of a year with a startup, their view about what is the main persona and what is the main proposition, it changes slightly. It usually changes slightly over the year. And that is why I often find that building also the branding gradually is useful.
I think it's more than just the branding. I think that you can deal with those type of challenges by tweaking the messaging, for example, on the homepage. The logo might stay exactly
right
as it was, but what's the main message on the homepage? The top banner. How is that worded? Mm-hmm. How is it designed? What type of campaigns are you running?
Right.
I think that there are, because of the digital world that we live in today, there are techniques that can help you pivot those very quickly. We can change a homepage in a day, right? We don't need 90 days to do that. And of course, you can also test either via different social campaigns, homepage banners, options, etc.
So actually, I would comment that when I'm thinking of the branding to be built over a year, I'm not referring to something like a logo so much, but more the tone of voice, the style,
the actual message that you're getting across.
Right. Because for startups, also developing the tone of voice of the startup is something that is a lot dependent on the team that's actually doing the creation of the content, right? And now during these times, the team, first of all, often grows, and then gradually you gain people who can write in different styles, talk in different styles, get interviewed in different styles. And so the company needs to gradually figure out what is the tone that serves them best. And also what is the tone that they can sustain.
Yep.
It's not enough that we as an agency come in and we tell them, okay, you guys should have a tone that's really cool, young, innovative, smart, a little bit, sophisticated, but not too stuffy and so on. We can decide all that. But then if we try to get their founder on video and he's really, really not that style, then there's no way that image is going to come across.
That's so true. And that's okay. and I think that people who are dealing with startups also have the ability to sift through what's, by the book and what's just a little bit left or right of that. I think it's completely okay. We all like things to be perfect, but in reality, we have to be pragmatic about stuff. And what you just mentioned comes up all day, every day. It's part of the brand manager or the marketing manager's role to try and keep things as narrow as possible. But every now and then you're going to swerve out a little bit and you need to make a little bit of an adjustment. That's part of what we do all day and every day for our clients.
Okay, so you gave us a lot of things to think about regarding branding. To sum up this discussion, I want to ask you, is there any one thing in particular that you think that you'd like startup marketers to remember when next time they sit to work on branding? What do you think is something they should be remembering?
In my mind, there's one word that I think should guide this entire process from day one through to infinity in terms of building a brand. And that's about consistency. If there's one word, I think that you should just write it on the back of, behind your chair, it's consistency. And it really boils down to a number of different things. I think that there needs to be consistency between the what you're portraying and the values. We spoke about that. In other words, how employees and customers feel about your brand. Is that truly what you feel about your brand? Is that consistent? I think that you need to ensure consistency between different types of users to ensure that everybody's getting the same type of feeling, and that what they expect to get is what they get. And then I think finally, just to make sure that from an executional point of view, you're as consistent as possible so that every time a user touches your brand, website, call center, entrance to the supermarket, social media, etc., they're getting that same message. So consistency.
Not just message in terms of what you're selling, but also message in terms of what you look like, what your style is.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So also visual message and
No question about
conceptual.
it.
Right?
And that's why we create brand books and brand guidelines. It's the executional side of the consistency that's important.
Yeah, I love that. Really. And it's not, I thank you for that, because it's not trivial. Often companies have a diverse team that works for them in marketing, and they sacrifice the consistency.
That's right.
And so I love that you said that. Just also intuitively think that consistency is something that contributes to trust, because when somebody sees that your brand is consistent, it makes you trustworthy.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay.
Great.
So it's been a pleasure. I'll meet you again on other topics next time.
Sounds good. Thanks for hosting me.
Thank you.
Take care.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the B2B Startup Growth Podcast, bringing you the latest wisdom on marketing, sales, growth hacking, and life as a startup leader. I'm your host, Shoham Eckhaus, and if there's a particular topic that you'd like me to cover soon, please reach out to me on b2bstartupgrowth.com and let me know.